right. Okay, today I want to talk about religion and because that's a chapter that we read was the religion chapter about the Second Great Awakening, and we're going to be moving around a little bit in time. We had talked about politics in the 1830s. We talked about the second party system, the Democrats and the Whigs, and we talked about the American Renaissance too. Excellent. Uh, and I want to talk now about religion and its relationship to slavery and anti slavery. I'm going to try to play some music here, and I hope you guys can hear it. Um, so let's just start with the second. We read before about the first and the second Great Awakening, but let's get that clear. The first of all, the background of this period of the long, from 1600 to the present. In general, what we see is growing secularism, right? So the this religion becomes less and less important in people's lives. Not that it's unimportant, but it's changing. This growing secularization, a growing declining importance of religion. It doesn't mean that there's not organized religion, but the Western Europe had been synonymous with the Christian world for a long time, notwithstanding the presence of Jews and Muslims in Europe. Um, and most people before 1600 spoke in the ideological language of the Virgin and the saints and the Savior. You would, before 1600, if you were going to boil an egg, you would say a Hail Mary, or two Hail Marys to know that the egg was boiled. But gradually from 1600 onward, there's a kind of emergence of Enlightenment ideas. And so what's going on in this image here on the right? This just sort of captures, I think, some of this growing secularism and the causes of it. What are some of the causes of the secular movement, or the sort of not anti-religious, but a sort of critical of religion that's emerging here? What do we see in this image? Sorry, it's a little bit off the page there. So what's going on in this image? And why might there be a kind of growing alcohol distilling? Okay, right on the right. So part of it is a kind of faith in science that's emerging after 1600. A sense that exploration of the New World, excellent. So we see Christopher Columbus and things like that. Scientific revolution, excellent. So those things on the left there, as Bria is saying, are kind of tools of the scientific revolution for measuring the world. We see gunpowder and war. So there's a growing sense that humans have more control over the world. And in a certain sense, with the scientific revolution, we have an increasing skepticism about religion. So when Napoleon asked the mathematician Laplace where God fit into his celestial mechanics, Laplace answered, "I have no need for such a hypothesis." So out and out atheism is rare, but among the scholars, writers, gentlemen, and gentlewomen of the 1700s and the 1800s, there's out and out. There's a kind of sense that science is in open conflict with Scripture, and these kinds of changes would be significant for a small number of elites, but also East Coast artisans who read scientific literature voraciously. Okay, so in this context, there are of growing secularization. We see two movements away from secularization, or two growing religious movements in the 19th century. One is American Christianity, and the other is the spread of Islam in North Africa. So in those two places, we're seeing a growing religious sentiment, and so that's one of the things that's helpful to kind of understand is that from the period from 1600 to the 19th century, we see growing secularism. But in the context of this, there are two periods of Protestant religious surges, and one of those is the First Great Awakening, and the other is the Second Great Awakening. We read before about this First Great Awakening. One of the things that's associated with that is the decline of deference, right? The decline of this a sense that of that the Bible is democratic, that all believers, that there's a kind of fellowship of believers, that that anyone can read the Bible and make decisions about what will make one saved. That sense of that growing sense of deference, or a decline of deference, is an important part of the revolution. It's during the revolution, though, that we see a kind of surge of not anti-religious, but what's called deism, and basically a rejection of certain kinds of religion, particularly revealed religion, and religion that is considered at the time dogmatic, a resentment of religious figures. And so this on the right, this image here is of Jefferson's Bible. And Jefferson basically went through the Bible and he cut out all the parts of the Bible that he believed were just made up, that couldn't be proved. So he has the Sermon on the Mount, he has those sorts of things, but the burning bush, but he doesn't have Lazarus coming back to life and things like that. So Jefferson made his own Bible that had the things that he liked about the Bible and took out the parts that he thought were problematic. So that's one of the features of deism, is basically a kind of criticism of religion. The Bible 2.0, right? The revised edition. And it's likewise that The Age of Reason is published by Thomas Paine in 1794. And Paine is a person who expresses the sort of democratic goals of small artisans and poor craftsmen and others. And it's the first book to argue in popular language that the Bible was not the Word of God. Paine wrote, "My mind is my own church. All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no more than human invention set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit." Okay, so that's deism. That's from 1760 to 1800. We see a lot of this emerge during the time of the Revolution, particularly on the East Coast, particularly among artisans and others. So this is not just an elite movement; it's a movement among workers and other people who work with their hands, men and women. A growing sense that this sort of democratic society can challenge certain parts of religious doctrine. Okay, so the period that we're looking at now is the Second Great Awakening, and that starts in 1801 by most historians' accounts in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. And the Second Great Awakening is called the Second Great Awakening, and the Second Great Awakening is the movement before was called deism. This is the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening, officially, there's no official movement. This is really a term that we use. No problem. This is really a term that we use to describe this period, because we do see a lot more people going to church, a lot more people being converted to Christianity, a lot more people being saved in the traditions of the newer churches, particularly the Baptist and the Methodist churches. So in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, this is a meeting of perhaps 20,000 people where basically meeting under tents. No sex nor color, class nor description were exempted from the pervading influence of the Holy Spirit, even from the age of 8 months to 60 years. People responded to the preaching that took place over the space of 8 days in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, with loud ejaculations of prayer. Some struck with terror, others trembling, weeping, crying out, fainting, swooning away. So it says wide appeal, the Second Great Awakening. It's basically to reject what your senses tell you and to embrace God nonetheless. That's the sort of idea of the Second Great Awakening. In the Southwest, it's a theology of hell and damnation, personal salvation, and it appeals in a way to people who live in harsh environments. So the Second Great Awakening has three different manifestations, I'd argue. One is in the North. We see the sort of society that we see in the North. It's popular among middle class folks, among women, especially, and is associated with reform. Okay, so connected with the Second Great Awakening, connected with this idea of works, not faith, an emphasis on works, not faith. This idea that you're predestined to be either saved or not saved goes away. That kind of Calvinism, and is replaced by a sense that you can be chosen by God by embracing God. And this is very different from older religious traditions, and it's most often associated with reform. In the Black South, it's going to be associated with syncretic religion, and syncretism, remember, is the kind of combining of native traditions and uh, religious traditions that flow out of books. And so this is a combination of African traditions and the Christian religion, often out of Bible scraps, and somewhat more radical. In the White South, this is going to emphasize the Old Testament authority and honoring the Father. So much more emphasis in the Old Testament in the Second Great Awakening in the South. Okay? So let's first talk about the North and what's changing. Okay, society is changing. So before this period, Bible scraps are, for example, so most, it's illegal to teach enslaved people to read, and so people would take a phrase from the Bible and memorize it, and create a sort of a whole sermon out of a single phrase. So this is very important in the Black church, this is in the kind of churches that are formed kind of secretly among enslaved people, and in Black churches in the North as well. And there'll be a single line. What did you call those three paths? Three paths. Basically, the Northern path, the Black Southern path, and the White Southern path. Three traditions, I think, of the Second Great Awakening. Okay. All right. So in the period before the second, at the beginning, very beginning, before the Second Great Awakening, we see in most in industry and things like that a fairly fixed relationship between artisans, journeymen, and apprentices. Okay, so the artisan is at the center here, right? This is the person who owns a shop. This is the person who sells goods. This is a person who, in this case, this is a construction site, and the artisan is someone who is what we would call a contractor, right? But he started out at the bottom here with one of these, children here, as an apprentice, basically carrying goods from one place to another. Basically doing the odd jobs and things like that that were required on the site. The journeymen are here on the left and the right, and they're just learning the craft of cutting timber for using an adze there on the right, using the tools that are required to make these a house. And the artisan is a person who's the master of the craft, and he's done usually a masterpiece. The term masterpiece is the piece that you do to demonstrate your mastery, to demonstrate that you are a master artisan. Okay, so that's the kind of rank, and you see this in silver crafting, in shoemaking, in woodworking, in basically paper making. What else? A lot of the things that are done, rope making, you'll see this hierarchy of artisan, journeyman, apprentice, and often the journeyman would live in the same household as the artisan, the apprentices as well, or nearby, right? And so there was a sort of control that the artisan had over these other people, but the expectation was, over the long term, if you did well, that you very likely might become an artisan. and that the possibility of an apprentice, a good apprentice, might become a journeyman, a good journeyman might become an artisan. That's the hope. Okay. By the period that we're talking about, by the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, what we see is a very different society where you don't have these craft relationships anymore. Manufacturing is emerging, and we see factories with relatively large numbers of workers. Okay, so the master here on the left is not the term that would have been used was owner or engineer or something like that. Who's that in this picture? Who are the people that are um, um, the equivalent of the artisan in this clock factory? Sorry, this image is pretty grainy. It's one of the first photographs we have of workers. But how do we know who's top hat guys? Excellent. Right. So the top hat. Yeah, good, great. It's the people with the top hat, the one who's standing in the back, and the one who's standing almost all the way on the left. And yeah, and there's a couple of others, and these would be the sort of owners of the shop. They would be the people who would be directing others. But everyone else in this picture is a workman. And you can tell they're masters because of the top hats, because of the three-piece suits, right? The vest and the jacket that demonstrates that they're not working with their hands. If you look back up here, the artisan still has a work vest. And here, this work vest is replaced by a dress vest. He very likely has a pocket watch. He'll have a bow tie. He'll have the top hat. He'll have the jacket. He'll have the long boots. And in a place like the clock factory, there'll be 30, 40, or 50 workers. Okay, these people are not going to be skilled workers, or are going to be semi-skilled workers, maybe, or relatively unskilled workers. Even the skilled workers, there's no chance, as they see it, that they're going to be owning this shop, right? The people who own the shop are of a different class, a pretty decidedly different class. And this is connected to these sort of transformations that we see in the North, in cities, mind you, not, again, the North is mostly agricultural in this period, but in cities in the North, what we see is a growing divide. It's even more pronounced here in this picture in a shoe factory of the 1850s. A shoe factory is going to have hundreds of workers in it, okay? Many of them are going to be children. Many of them are going to be immigrants. The owner of this factory is not a person who's going to necessarily know the day-to-day work involved, and he's not going to live anywhere near the people that work for him. Does that make sense? So what we see is more of a hierarchy, and this is important for religion because when the Second Great Awakening hits, it initially appeals to people like the guy in the top hat, who is worried about losing control of the workers below him. He's worried about making sure that people like him can be, brought in to the sort of society, that they won't form unions. There's a fear that they're going to form unions. His control over labor is weakened. Saloons and unions sprang up in workingmen's neighborhoods. And by 1830, in Rochester, New York, for example, which is a city that grew up along the Erie Canal, you see people like Charles Finney emerge. Let me show you an image of Charles Finney. Okay, so that's Charles Finney there on the left. Charles Finney is associated with the Second Great Awakening. And he arrives in Rochester, and he's invited first by the men there on the left, the sort of middle class or upper middle class of New York, and of Rochester, New York. And he preaches to workers, right? He preached every night and 3 times on Sunday, first converting the city's business elite, often through their wives, and then many workers. Rochester experienced a citywide prayer meeting that lasted 6 months. And so this northern middle class men, shop owners and businessmen, emphasized the link between piety and industriousness, right? So if you were a good Christian man, you worked hard, and they tried to inculcate this or try to get this spread among their workers. Northern middle class women emphasized the link between piety and charity, and so a sense of duty to others. So this is the sort of northern middle class religion that we see emerging in the 1820s and 1830s, and it tended to be somewhat critical of workers. Okay, this is a scene from the tenement home of New York, and it's captures some of the evangelical religious traditions that are emerging in this period. And so, what's going on in this picture? What's happened here? This is the 1850s, and this is supposed to be in a tenement house. Someone's passed out. Okay. And sorry about the graininess of the image. And why is he passed out? Right. This is in support of temperance. There's an alcohol bottle, a liquor bottle. That's right. So there's a liquor bottle on the ground next to him, pouring out the last of the whatever it is. He got blackout drunk. In fact, he's dead. Right. So he's had too much. He's drunk. He's dead. And so what we're seeing here is this is the coroner, I guess, who's arrived trying to figure out how this man died of alcohol poisoning. And you see on the right the tragedy, right, of the woman and the wife and the child who no longer have a father, the wife who no longer has a husband, the child who no longer has a father. And look up on the right. Can you see up on the right what's there? Above her head on the right? There's maybe it's too grainy. But on the right is a picture, a painting of Jesus. Okay? Crucifixion, right? And so on the one hand, this is a sort of description of of death, right? Yeah, it's sorry. Yeah, it's a terrible. It's terrible. I wish there were a better. I was looking around for a less grainy version of this. So this is a Catholic household, okay? So rather than in a Protestant household, you would have a cross, but you would not have a picture of Jesus on the cross. That was considered a sort of graven image in many Protestant houses, and so the fact that there's a picture of Christ on the cross suggests that this is a Catholic home. And so the implicit argument in this image is that this is a Catholic family that drinks too much, or in which the father drinks too much, and leaves a wife and child destitute. Okay, so what does this have to do with the Second Great Awakening? Well, one of the things that we see in the Second Great Awakening is an increasing interest in temperance, in trying to cut back alcohol consumption by the working class. We see this in Charles Finney's lectures, and we see this in his sermons. This idea that you should be pious and that you should be industrious. We see this also in a kind of emphasis on reading the Bible. So we'll also see in the Second Great Awakening a huge proliferation of Sunday schools. And Sunday schools are not just for kids. Sunday schools are designed to basically teach literacy to people. Literacy is high in the United States, but Sunday school is designed to teach literacy to children so that they can read the Bible themselves, so that they can be converted. The U.S. probably has the highest literacy in the world in this period, in the 1830s and 1840s, and in large part it's because of this impulse towards the Second Great Awakening impulse, this emphasis on reading the Bible oneself. Now, this is true among white people in the United States. This is not true among enslaved people in the United States because it's illegal, as we saw before, to teach enslaved people to read. There are enslaved people who do read, who teach themselves to read, but that's less the case. Okay, so another thing that's associated with this reform, besides temperance, is an emphasis on anti-slavery. And the anti-slavery impulse in Northern religion is interesting. It's connected to the sort of same idea of temperance, which is that anything that gets between you and God is a problem, right? So liquor gets between you and God. Prostitution gets between you and God. Fornication, lewd images get between you and God. But also slavery gets between you and God because enslaved people are not allowed to read. And so slavery as an institution is not just wrong because it's people owning other people, because that's in the Old Testament. What's wrong with slavery is that in denying black people and enslaved people the right to read, they're being denied access to God. That's the concern. That's the fear. Okay, but this is not entirely true. That there is a religious tradition in the American South that is very distinctive. And let me bear with me here for a second while I pull this up. Okay, so in the South there is a second Great Awakening, but it's complicated. It's complicated by the fact that Methodist and Baptist ministers are traveling around trying to convert people, willing to convert anyone, black or white, to religion, to Christianity. But the fear is that that a minister is going to encourage slave revolts. And so in the Second Great Awakening, Baptist and Methodist ministers dress more like a planter. They approach planters when they come to a region. They have correspondence to identify enslavers that will accept them, and rather than just arriving and trying to convert people. By the 1830s, these are older and married ministers. They identify the home as the church rather than the class meetings. And so rather than going around and trying to grab people and convert them, they focus on converting one house at a time. Now, in the American South, we see a very different, among African Americans, we see a very, very different thing. First of all, repression. We read about Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a lay minister. He taught himself to read, and he was the head of a small slave revolt in Virginia, in which, how many, 30 or 40 people are killed, and then all of the people who are connected with Nat Turner's revolt are hanged, including Nat Turner himself. When Nat Turner who leads this slave revolt in Virginia, is caught and arrested, they ask him what he thought he was doing, and did he understand that he was going to die? And he said, "Was not Christ crucified?" Right? And so there's a sort of recognition that there are pretty radical parts of the Bible by African Americans, and so this is where we get to the Bible scraps. Planters wanted to make sure that ministers steered away from revolutionaries when they arrived. So don't talk about Moses, don't talk about Abraham, don't talk about Jonah, right? And focus on the parts of the Bible that appeared to support slavery. So enslaved people told that they were sons of Ham, that they were doomed to slavery, and that there was their duty to honor their masters. But small scraps of the Bible about Moses, Abraham, and Jonah start to circulate among enslaved people. And so among the enslaved, stories of Moses, Abraham, and Jonah, the revolutionaries of the Bible, are very popular subjects. I want to play you some music from this. This is a burying song, and it's recorded in the 1930s, but I think captures. This is a burying song that goes back to the 1830s. Hopefully this will work. Can you guys hear that? Okay, and so what we see is a sort of syncretic. So this is a burying song, and burial was an important part of African traditions throughout the American South in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. It blends with African traditions of burying and singing to the dead that you see in Igbo and Yoruba traditions, Senegambian traditions on the West, in which a parade and a singing to the person who's being buried is a crucial part of this. And so there is a kind of Christian religion that's in here in part, but it's also a kind of African tradition. And this is a kind of syncretic tradition that's a crucial part of. Oh, sorry, yeah. So these are Igbo and Yoruba traditions in West Africa. Okay, enslaved people made religion their own. They were allowed to, enslavers allowed people to choose the religious order that they wanted, and most were attracted to the Baptists for a few reasons. For one, it was loosely organized and allowed enslaved people some authority in organizing the congregation. And much of the church services were often in secret. So people, an enslaved person would take a pot and turn it upside down, in the belief that the upside down pot it was basically a symbol to meet together that night to have a service, and the expectation was that the upside down pot would prevent the enslaver from knowing that there was a sermon. It was a kind of a hidden symbol. And many West African religions had a whole variety of holy figures who you would appeal to for different things and who would possess holy men and women. And so this idea about possession, which grows up in the African religious traditions, is then brought over into Christianity in the American South. And so what we see is possession by the Holy Spirit. Right? People who are moved to speak in tongues, people who are moved to dance, even though dancing is illegal in the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. It's acceptable to dance when one is captured by the Holy Spirit and moved in this way. Okay, so this is the religious tradition. It's a mixture of African traditions and but borrowing pieces, little scraps, really, from the Bible. It's widespread. We know it's widespread because once the war is over, once slavery is over, these churches spring up immediately all over. Right. Yeah. You've heard that the line, the joke. Why do Methodists, why do Baptists hate premarital sex? Because it could lead to dancing. Right, and so dancing was considered unacceptable. But if one was moved by the Holy Spirit, it was possible then to move around, to have your hands in the air, to shake. And the sermons tended to be call and response. Bear with me here. Okay, this is a.
In the early days of the settlers in South Carolina, Beaufort County, when the church was first established there, before there were schools and seminaries, why the preachers preached mostly by imagination. And as I've been in contact during my boyhood days with quite a few of the settlers from that part of the state, I've learned this sermon how an old minister used to preach it a long time ago. And instead of being able to read a text from the Bible, he just imagined something and went on to preach it in a form of dialect, as I shall give you now, as near as I can imitate him. He said, sisters and brothers, me think I will talk this morning about Gad and Adam. He said, Gad been a good Gad. He make the world, he make everything in the world. And man been the last thing God can get me to make. And then when God make man say, him look around out there and the cow had a pattern and the goat had a pattern. The sheep had a pattern, so everything had a pattern but man. And God him was sorry for man. Him take a little fan and he find man to sleep. And when he get man found to sleep, he easy hand in man's side and take a rib out man's side, make a woman and give man. The man partner. And then when God will give man this woman, say, God tell us now you have to eat all the trees in the garden. But the day you eat that tree in the middle of the garden, that'll be the day you die. And so then, so as soon as God went to go back to his rest place, the woman that God give man to sneak out across the garden and see a little red apple hanging on the tree. Him snatch him down and bite him, so him taste so good. Him
Okay, so that's a Gullah sermon. That's and again, it's recorded in around 1920, but it's a Gullah sermon that goes back to the 1840s and 1850s. As you can hear in the sermon, it's partly spoken and partly sung. And at the peak of the singing point, the congregation is asked to join in. And so that a little phrase would be repeated again and again by the congregation. So I want to play you Sheep, Sheep, Don't You Know the Road?
sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yeah, Lord, I know the road. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road? Yeah, Lord, I know the road. Don't you know the road by the place of the sun? Yeah, Lord, I know the road. Don't you know the road by the singing of the song? Yeah, Lord, I know the road. Don't you know the road by the praying of the prayer? Yeah, Lord, I know the road. Don't you know the road by the praise of the prayer? Yeah, Lord, I know the road.
Okay, and that's from the South Carolina Sea Islands, again from the 1920s, an imitation of an older religious tradition. And so what you hear is the one person is the caller who sings out the song, and then the chorus comes from everyone else. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is the religious tradition that's an African religious tradition. It blends West African traditions. It's call and response, what's called syncopation. And it's communal. It's there's a the minister was a fellow worshiper rather than the final authority. It was even more communal than white churches in the Second Great Awakening. The service would be call and response. The service would, as you heard before, had a rhythmic and intense delivery, which would build up towards a climax in which the minister would then break out into a chant and a song, and then other people would answer the song. Because the sermon relies on the congregation and because they're seldom written down, each sermon is different and more like poetry than a traditional sermon. So if you've been to a Black Baptist church, this is a familiar, probably familiar to you, particularly a holiness church or an AME church. Has anybody been to one of these? Right, right. You had to listen to the motherboard and know. Right. Okay. So this is the tradition, the Second Great Awakening tradition that emerges under slavery. Okay, it's one that has these features, some of which. Okay, right. Some of these features that are African traditions and that emerge in the around from the 1830s through the 1850s, and this is the Second Great Awakening among African Americans. Sheep, sheep, don't you know the road is one of these. Okay, so something about the singing. This is the way in which the singing works are often with accidental harmonies. There tends to be in some of these churches there is a person would have fits of a religious ecstasy in which they would be possessed by the Holy Spirit and speak in tongues. This would only be, though, in a certain part of the service, and you would never cross your feet in this service because crossing your feet was dancing, and this was unacceptable. Okay, so these are the traditions the southern African American traditions that cross the Ohio River into the North in the 1830s and 1840s. And one of the places that they cross is near Cincinnati. So Kentucky is a slave state here, and we see Indianapolis and Ohio above it. And when enslaved people either buy their own freedom or are freed or free themselves by escaping, many of them settle just in the states of Indiana and Ohio and Illinois. Some of them move up to Canada, but others of them stay near the coast. And we see this AME, African Methodist Episcopal churches, Southern Black Baptist churches emerge in these places as well. The runaways were by far the most important rebels, because those who made it to the North formed an anti-slavery movement and an abolitionist movement that ultimately brought an end to the enslavement of those left behind. Former enslaved people like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman created associations that assisted fugitive slaves and operated a free black press that spread the word about slavery's horrors. These people traveled and spoke widely in the United States. Black anti-slavery advocates first made tours in the 1820s and 1830s, often in the company of Quakers. And what they did was they appropriated this camp meeting style, this black musical tradition, when they traveled north. So they would sing songs that were Christian songs from the South in the North, told the story of their escape, and preached to thousands of white Americans about the evils of slavery. In a peculiar way, the underground evangelical movement in this slave quarter was a sort of training ground for black abolitionists. Okay, so now I want to talk about the people that are transformed by this black religious tradition in the North, particularly in Cincinnati. So we'll start with Charles Grandison Finney. So Charles Grandison Finney is tells people that they need to obey their factory owners, that that they need to get close to God, but not to differ too much from other workers. Don't join unions. Don't drink too much. But one of his disciples is Theodore Weld, and Theodore Weld is he's a disciple of Charles Finney, but Theodore Weld is an abolitionist, someone who has been transformed by this tradition. He's having, unlike many other Second Great Awakening followers, he has eaten at the table of African Americans in Cincinnati and in Cleveland and in places like this. He convinces, so he decides, Theodore Weld decides that he's going to travel to Lane Seminary and do some abolition work. And so he comes to Lane Seminary, which is in Cincinnati, Ohio. And let's go back to here, where Cincinnati, Ohio is. Cincinnati, Ohio is just across the Ohio River from Kentucky, just across, just right on the border between slavery and freedom. Okay? And the Lane Seminary, Lane Seminary, is led by this man in the center, Lyman Beecher, and there are two professors. He does look a little rakish, doesn't he? Yeah. Yeah, it's not somebody you would entirely trust, maybe. Although that's an awesome tie. I have to say that tie is pretty good. But although it looks a little bit like a Christmas present, but yeah, no, it's someone who would maybe put a roofie in a drink. Okay, so what Weld does is he goes as a student to Lane Seminary, but he's a little bit of a he actually wants to change Lane Seminary. Now, Lane Seminary is 10 miles outside of Cincinnati, and it's led by Lyman Beecher. It's got two professors, Calvin Stowe, and Baxter Dickinson. And in 1833 and 34, that session, Theodore Dwight Weld joins them as a student. Um, and in 1833, there is a cholera epidemic. And as a result, everyone is isolated in the dormitory. Uh, and uh, so the dormitory there is on the right. And so Theodore Dwight Weld, who arrives there, the cholera epidemic strikes, and Weld stays with the other students. But the professors are separated from the students, and it's there that Weld convinces a close friend, William Allen, a person who has become a close friend. Okay, so sorry, let me just say a couple things about Lane Seminary. So Lane Seminary is a second grade awakening institution. It's designed to teach many of the people who are coming into Lane Seminary are what are called colporteurs. And colporteurs are people who bring religious tracts to other people. If you've ever been walking around and been handed a New Testament, I guess you guys must have been. Imagine, right? You guys have been handed the New Testament, right? At some point, either last year. There wasn't a whole lot of that this year, but those, yeah, right. So many of these people, these are adults that are in this. Sorry, when I say adult, these are not 18 to 21-year-olds in Lane Seminary. These are mostly people in their mid to late 20s, even their 30s. Right, like the people outside of Tate. Exactly. That's what colporteurs are. People trying to persuade you to take up religion. They'll give you. And so that's the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening is really the beginning of that kind of movement of sending people abroad, elsewhere, to distribute tracts. And so these people are Second Great Awakening people. They know something about God, but they don't know that much Greek or Latin. They don't know their Bible that well. Lane Seminary, and and so it's Lyman Beecher, Calvin Stowe, and Baxter Dickinson, and Stowe and Dickinson are basically professors of Greek, and they know their Old Testament and New Testament backwards and forwards. But Weld, basically, during this cholera epidemic, convinces a close friend who's named William Allen, and an heir to a large slave estate, that slavery is wrong. And he begins to talk to others about immediate emancipation. And so this is the difference between anti-slavery and abolitionist. Anti-slavery people believed that slavery was a bad thing, but that the way to solve it was to send enslaved people back to Africa, or basically to convince people that over the long term slavery was a bad thing, and that eventually they would free the people that they owned. Calvin Stowe was like this. He was anti-slavery, but he was not abolitionist. Abolitionists believe once you've decided that slavery is wrong, you should do everything in your power to make slavery end. Everything in your power, even if it means breaking the law. Right? If you recognize that slavery is wrong, then you cannot waste another minute in ending the institution of slavery. So that's what an abolitionist is. And so Theodore Weld is an abolitionist, but the professors and the head of Lane Seminary understand that the people who come to Lane Seminary are coming from the North and the South. It's all white, all men. And that it would be a bad idea to be too publicly anti-slavery. So even though Calvin Stowe personally believes that slavery is a bad thing, he's not going to talk about it. Theodore Weld, though, is. And the cholera epidemic is an excellent environment for Theodore Weld because he's able to speak to the students without the professors in the room. And he convinces William Allen, the person who is going to be a slave owner in a few years, begins to talk to others about immediate emancipation. And then William Allen and Theodore Weld persuade maybe half of the students in this dormitory that slavery is a bad thing. In February of 1834, the quarantine is broken. And the group gets together and decides to open up a series of debates in Lane Seminary about whether slavery is godly and whether the American Colonization Society is unchristian. So the American Colonization Society remember, is the society that advocates moving enslaved people back to Africa. Now, another thing that the Lane students start to do is is to go up to black churches and participate in black churches as and go to dinners with black church members and learn about their experiences, learn about how they found God, and many of them are persuaded in speaking to Black Baptists and Methodists in Cincinnati that slavery is a horrible crime. They hear stories about the horrors of slavery. They see the scars that some of them can show from slavery and the stories of their escape. So the students organize a sort of debating society to discuss whether the American Colonization Society is unchristian. Lyman Beecher goes berserk, right? Lyman Beecher says, this is not your job. This is not what you're here to do. You're here to learn the Old Testament. You're here to learn to speak Greek. You're here to learn, improve your Latin so that you can read the Vulgate version of the Bible. You're not here to be talking about slavery. But nonetheless, the students meet, and there are 10 days of speeches. Almost all the students, and 1/3 of them are Southerners, declare that slavery is ungodly and that the American Colonization Society is an unchristian institution. Okay, so that basically these even these former slaveholders or children of slaveholders are persuaded that slavery is wrong. In those speeches, some of them, young men, describe what slavery is like from their experience and how horrible it was. They describe people being sold, families being separated. They describe the terrible beatings that they've seen. They describe it from the perspective of a child of a slaveholder, but they can describe in great detail how horrible slavery is. Not only is the board upset about these anti-slavery discussions, but they're also horrified that they set up a school for ex-slaves in Cincinnati, the students. There's a 2-day school that's for boys and later a select female school for girls. And this was taught by female volunteers from New York called the Sisters, who basically take it upon themselves to teach people to read. Stuck in the middle is Lyman Beecher, the president, Calvin Stowe, one of the professors. Stowe tries to convince them to stop. Lyman Beecher, the president of the college, wrote in June to a friend, if we and our friends do not amplify the evil by too much alarm, impatience, and attempt at regulation, this evil will subside. The evil he's talking about is people talking about slavery. Lyman Beecher, Calvin Stowe, and Catherine Beecher try everything they do to stop the controversy. They are impressed by the abolitionist Theodore Weld. They're impressed by his religious credentials, but they think he's going to destroy everything. While President Beecher is away in New England, the board fires one of the faculty and closes down the student society and promises that there will be further censure of students if students continue to discuss matters not directly related to theology. President Beecher and Stowe then come back in October and jointly write a statement that while they support voluntary associations, they saw nothing that was nothing in the regulations that is not common law in all well-regulated institutions. In other words, Stowe and Beecher believe that it's acceptable to fire the other professor. This wasn't Dickinson, but this was another professor who's there. In other words, expelling anti-slavery faculty was okay. 2 days later, 28 students issued a joint request to be dismissed from Lane Seminary. The next day, 11 others resigned from the seminary. The following day, Weld resigns, and they ask for an honorable end to their commission and issue a statement of reasons for leaving. Their principal reason is free discussion. They say, it is our right. Free discussion is a duty and consequently a right, and is inherent and inalienable. It was before we entered Lane Seminary, privileges which we might and did relinquish, advantages which we might and did receive. By this right, the institution cannot give or take away our right to discuss what we want. These people then break away and form a separate organization called Lane Seminary. It's called Oberlin College. And Oberlin College is formed by the students anti-slavery students who left Lane Seminary. Okay. So this is one part, right? And so, and one of the interesting things about this is that she was there. Harriet Beecher, Lyman's daughter, was in the audience among the 10 and listened to the speeches by anti-slavery folks given. And her husband, soon-to-be husband, Calvin Stowe, was also, he did not come, but she attended all 10 of these discussions. Okay. Now I want to talk about Asa Hutchinson. Asa and John Hutchinson, each of them look like this. Basically, they have long beards. And I've got a better picture of them. So there's the two of them, one with and without the beard. They're called the Tribe of Asa around 1840. They travel with a black vocal group called the Luca family, and they try to convert people. They sing the anti-slavery songs, the songs about Jonah, the songs about Abraham, the songs about Noah, to draw a crowd, and then seek to persuade them to become religious, to become Christians, but also to embrace abolitionism. They become incredibly popular, but they also court tremendous opposition. And so when they come into a town, they begin by singing, they draw a crowd, and then they move into anti-slavery songs. Some would cheer them, but it would lead to fistfights and things like that, as other people who supported slavery would hear that these missionaries are traveling around singing in public performances, but also talking about anti-slavery. This becomes an incredibly popular organization, and this is the Hutchinson family by the 1857s. These traditions, increasingly in-your-face abolitionist tradition, and the more refined hierarchical tradition of the Southern churches knock against each other in the Second Great Awakening. And they constantly come in contact and constantly set off sparks. They break the Lane Seminary. The abolitionists grasp perhaps the advent of a northern society with railroads, merchant cities that are increasingly specialized. The Hutchinson family sings a song, one of their most popular songs, called Get Off the Track. And let me play that for you.
Oh, the car of emancipation rides majestic through the nation, bearing on its train slowly liberty, a nation's glory. Roll it along, roll it along, roll it along through the nation, freedom's car of emancipation.
Okay, so that's the song. Ho the Car Emancipation. It's called Get Off the Track, right? And the song is Get Off the Track is what you do if a train is coming, right? And the train is emancipation. The future is emancipation, according to this song. So what's going on in this? Let's take a look at the lyrics here. Um, what's what's being described here? What's the story about? How are these people responding to the Second Great Awakening? What kind of language are they using? Let's take a look at this phrase in this right down here in the middle. This would certainly cause a lot of fistfights. Okay, I think too that there's a the song is catchy and and it became a popular song. These become really the first musical stars really of the 19th century, the Hutchinson family. What does it say here on the right? Just to the right of me, it says, "Railroads to emancipation cannot rest on clay foundation, and the tracks of the magician are but railroads to perdition." What does that mean? Who's the magician? What does it mean? This is a very political song, right? Um, Henry Clay, is the head of the Whig Party. The magician is Martin Van Buren, right? And so what they're doing is rejecting both the Democratic and the Whig Party, the entire two-party system. Um, okay, so the two-party system saw itself as the arbiter of national affairs. The newspapers were supported by either Democrats or Whigs. And they told you basically Democratic news or Whig news. Um, but anger at established political institutions led the Lane rebels and the Hutchins family and others to use the new medium of music uh, and railroads to distribute these cheap novels and sell them for almost nothing. One of the things that the colporteurs do, the anti-slavery colporteurs do, is to distribute anti-slavery almanacs, like the one here, um, which it's an almanac, but as I said before, but on the right it says, "In Kentucky there lived a wicked woman, a slaveholder and a member of the Presbyterian Church. One of her slaves was mother of two children, 7 and 9 years old. The woman sold the mother to another slaveholder and did not let her know it. When she was seized, she shrieked and cried, and the children cried when they saw her mother, uh, when they saw their mother torn from them." Okay, so this is the so the colporteur system is one that's also used by anti-slavery people to distribute anti-slavery literature in the South. No one understood this, I think, better than the last Lane rebel. That was Harriet Beecher, age 22, was in the audience of the Lane rebels debate in 1834. She gets married, she attends anti-slavery family performances, and joins an anti-slavery organization. In 1850, she reads about Henry Clay and the Compromise of 1850. This is Henry Clay in the center who organizes this, the political compromise of 1850 between Democrats and Whigs, establishes that there'll be no slave trade in D.C., that California will be a free state. We'll talk about this more next class. Texas has slavery, but it's cut off. And New Mexico and Utah can decide about slavery, but that the Fugitive Slave Act will be strengthened, and that people who are enslaved, who are discovered, if any person who claims to be a slave holder can travel anywhere in the North, claim someone, and have state officials pay for the removal of that person to the South. She's horrified by this, and she sits down and recalls the debates at Lane Seminary. Her novel, which she writes in the kitchen after her kid's asleep, starts in 1850. And the structure is the American Renaissance story, very sentimental, but shaped around an anti-slavery message. It's syndicated in the National Era magazine and reaches millions of readers. The story has some of the conventions of the minstrel show. So a simple black man, Uncle Tom, but a suffering Christ figure. Obsession over the family of a biracial woman whose son will be sold down the river. And so, this, as problematic as Uncle Tom's Cabin is as a story, it's designed to make readers feel akin to the problems of this biracial woman who has her children sold away from her. Her escape with her son is over ice floes across the Ohio River to Cincinnati. And what she does is she takes what she heard in Lane Seminary in 1834 and produces a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It hits like a thunderclap. Sells over 300,000 copies in the first year. It's translated in 30 languages by the second year. Okay. Yes, Harriet, who is wrote the book on the right. The book on the left, the awful disclosures of Maria Monk, we talked about before. That was the bestseller of the 1840s, right? About the horrors of Catholicism. But if you look at the image, it's almost directly robbed from in Uncle Tom's Cabin with the first version on the right, and in it, it's not the Catholic priest who's the horrible person. It is Simon Legree. Okay. So to conclude, the culture of the plantation transmitted north to Cincinnati brings a new doctrine to of immediate abolitionism, which is then adopted by white radicals and former slaves. Yes, sorry. So let me, yeah. Okay, so this is the Beecher family. Catherine Beecher doesn't like slavery, but she thinks that people should not be. This is her older sister, but thinks that no one should take away that slaves that slavery should only be taken away a little bit at a time. Okay, the younger sister Harriet Beecher marries Calvin Stowe. Her father is Lyman Beecher, the head of the Lane Seminary. She's scared to disagree with her sister, her older sister. She's scared to disagree with her father. Rather than do so politically and publicly, she writes a novel. The novel has baked in it an abolitionist message, not an anti-slavery message, not a kind of tame, oh, slavery is bad, but we should do something about it sometime, but an abolitionist message that says that slavery has to end immediately. It's her secret way of bypassing her own family and getting across the message that she's learned in Cincinnati about the horrors of slavery. So the culture of the plantation, the religious tradition of the plantation, is transmitted north to Cincinnati and places like it. And with it, a new doctrine of immediate abolition comes to white radicals and former slaves. Using new media, including traveling singers of folk songs, a penny press, and abolitionist propaganda, allows a new message to escape from the male-centered second party system that Martin Van Buren imagines. Right. That anti-slavery is what the Beechers practice, which is slavery is bad, enslaved people should be sent back to Africa. Abolition is what Harriet Beecher Stowe believes in, which is that if you believe that slavery is bad, you need to end it right now. Okay. I am going to open up a quiz on ELC. It's a little bit late, so I will. Okay, I've posted a quiz. Bear with me a second. All right, posted a quiz, so you would do that. Yeah, I've left it until 2:40 to finish. Oh, sorry. No. Uh, oh, okay. So sorry. So did the family disown her? No, they were horrified. Calvin Stowe didn't know that she was writing this, and uh, forever after, he ultimately became an abolitionist by basically by the time of the Civil War. He was anti-slavery before that, and people made fun of him for this. They said that he was basically in Harriet Beecher Stowe's train, that he was basically followed her. The Beecher family, which was didn't think thought that slavery was wrong, but was unwilling to criticize any white Southerners about it. The Beecher family was quite rich, or fairly rich. Harriet Beecher Stowe is so he did ultimately become abolitionist, basically by the time the Civil War started. But the rest of the Beecher family were also, also ultimately were converted to her side, but only by the war itself. Okay, the exam is until 2:40, so you've got a little bit of time. I'm sorry to spring it on you for folks who have a class shortly. We'll talk more about Harriet Beecher Stowe. We'll talk about Texas and what about how we get to the Compromise of 1850. Next class. Thanks, everybody.